My name's Erin. I work at Americans United for separation of church and state. And I just really wanted to start by thanking the Secular Student Alliance for inviting me here to talk about what I think and what we at Americans United think is of growing importance, particularly under the new Trump-Pence administration, and that is a multi-faith approach to preserving church-state separation and a secular government. So for folks who aren't familiar with Americans United, we are a nonpartisan educational and advocacy organization dedicated to advancing the constitutional principle of church-state separation and ensuring freedom of religion, including the right to believe or not for all Americans. We work in the courts, the legislature. We have a grassroots network of local chapters and activists. And our members, supporters, staff all come from many different backgrounds, many different religions, as well as secular folks. And so because we have this, our base is made up of so many different people, we are a multi-faith organization, and we take a multi-faith approach to our advocacy strategy. So when I was making this PowerPoint, I originally had like 1 million slides for this because there are that many threats to church-state separation under the Trump-Pence administration. But I just chose 4 that our organization is really putting a lot of focus on in the coming years. So 1, we have Education Secretary Betsy DeVos and her school choice agenda. And this really is a funneling of taxpayer dollars into private religious schools that receive virtually no oversight through tuition tax credits and voucher schemes or public money. Also, an immigration ban that targets Muslim and violates the Establishment Clause. So, during the presidential campaign, Trump made a promise to ban Muslims and admitted that he would claim this discriminatory policy was really a ban aimed at territories. So we're seeing exactly what he promised. And we are fighting this mainly in the courts through amicus briefs in support of some of the states that have been fighting back against this. The third is legislation that allows people to use their interpretation of religious freedom to undermine other civil rights. And we've, of course, seen this before the Trump-Pence administration. But now we're seeing it on a federal in addition to a state level. So I think I mentioned last night an example of adoption bills that allow taxpayer-funded child welfare programs to refuse to serve any child or family if doing so is contrary to what the agency refers to as their sincerely held religious beliefs. So under this bill, taxpayer-funded service provider could refuse to place a child with an otherwise qualified same-sex couple. They could refuse a family because of their religion, if they didn't practice a religion, if they were a single parent, or they could refuse to provide access to reproductive health care to a teen in foster care who had been sexually abused, right? So this is like particularly insidious stuff we're seeing. And then, that got cut off a little bit, but the third is movement to weaken or repeal the Johnson Amendment. And I will get into this in a little bit, but can maybe I just see a show of hands, who out here is familiar with the Johnson Amendment? Who's heard about that? Oh, that's awesome. All right, most of you, okay. And one thing I wanted to say before I got started is I don't want to stand up here and talk at you for the entire time, so in addition to the Q&A, I'm going to just kind of throw out a couple questions, and so my hope is that if you want to participate, you can be loud and vocal without having to pass around some of the mics. So before I get into some of what we at Americans United and me see as coalition work, I'd love to just hear from you all some of what your experience has been, and maybe we can kind of build off that through the rest of the talk as well. So if we could know another show of hands, who here has had your group work with a religious or interfaith group to do a joint event? Okay. who's worked with a religious or interfaith group to do advocacy work? So for a particular policy or something on campus or in your local community that you wanted to change, who's partnered with a religious group to see that through? Right, yeah. And that doesn't surprise me because it's trickier, right? And it's really challenging work. And at Americans United, there is an ever-present tension in the work that we do because it's not easy to have secular folks and religious folks working together all the time. And that's okay. And I'm here to say it's worth it because it's really important. So for those of you who raised your hand to the first question, would anybody be willing to just kind of stand up and share what you did and just a real quick how it went? Yeah, totally.
Yeah, so we had a joint meeting with this group called Christian Apologetics, which is basically a group that tries to philosophically defend the existence of God. And then our group, Secular Panthers, we had a joint meeting where we had kind of like a debate, and then we also had both groups met for an actual debate with other. One was a Christian pastor, and the other one was a philosophy teacher. And, we were making the argument that God exists, does God not exist?
Mm-hmm. And how did it go?
It went really well. Both groups were really just motivated primarily to learn more about the other side. So it wasn't like a competition. It was really just like curiosity.
Awesome. Does anybody else want to share? No? Sorry, it's a little hard for me to see. Oh yeah, I can't even see you. I can't see you. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, so we partnered in Dallas, we partnered with a religious organization who had special discounts on food with the food bank because of their nonprofit status. And we leveraged our radio show and podcast to raise money. And we partnered with the religious group to get the discounts on the price. And then we were able to raise money for a local senior center in our area and was actually able to feed them for the entire year by combining those efforts with the churches.
That's fantastic. Yeah. Thank you both for sharing. Anybody else? Yeah.
We have kind of a negative experience.
Mm-hmm.
We're trying to get some of the faith groups on campus to support the Ask an Atheist and come.
Mm-hmm.
And the leader there kept trying to get our president to say, well, then you come to this. And they didn't show up for our event, but they kept hassling her, well, you need to come to ours. So that didn't work out so well.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. And it's not easy work, and it's not always going to, you're not always going to have a good result. But thank you all for sharing. I think this is also a little selfish of me because I just, doing this work, I always just kind of like to hear what people's experiences are. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that there is always a tension that undergirds this work. But also, well, I'll get into that. I don't want to follow my train of thought too far and get off my presentation. But so Trump administration, what's a church-state separation defender to do? So for me and for the people that I work with doing this work, coalitions are key. And they're key because they demonstrate that the constitutional principle of church-state separation is broadly supported by many different faiths as well as secular folks. And to ground ourselves really in this particular, that we should be acutely aware that the Trump-Pence administration fronts as though they're speaking on behalf of the majority of Americans when it comes to issues of religious freedom, right? But they are really speaking on behalf of a small group of people who think that this was founded as a Christian nation and that it should be treated as such now. And it's vitally important that we continue to counter that narrative. So how do we build coalition? There's some ideological battles, I think, for secular folks when they decide how to build coalitions with religious folks. And I think that the threats to church-state separation, and more broadly, civil liberties, just call for more intersectional coalition work all around, including coalitions of those who believe and they do not. And because part of this is oftentimes coalition addressing issues of religious freedom by and from don't include secular folks. They don't include atheists, agnostics, and humanists, and et cetera, et cetera. And And my hope for young secular folks is that they envision a movement that's not just building a bigger secular base, but in addition to that is empowering people to work on multiple issues. And the key to that is always be finding a seat at the table. The experiences you have and the secular perspective on issues of freedom from and for religion, it is vitally important that you find a seat at the table and contribute in these issues, both at your school, at the state level, and then at the federal level, especially now. So another question to ask in the realm of coalitions is usually, who is the right messenger? And when we think of who the right messenger is, it's not always going to be you. And in coalitions generally, not just in religious and secular coalitions, right? You should always be paying attention to power dynamics and place people who are most directly impacted in the front of the microphone. So in this realm of coalition work, sometimes it's going to be people who are of minority religions, and sometimes it's going to be you. So questions to ask are, when are you an ally, and when are you calling on your allies in this coalition work? And then this third question, I think, is kind of, you can read it two different ways. So the what challenges us, or who can challenge us. And part of this is, who is the opposition? And what are their barriers? And who or what can get them over their barriers? And I'm gonna move into an example in a bit, so these questions are just kind of floating around. But and the second piece to that is working with people who are different than you can also help you look inward. So I think at least for me, as someone who identifies as a secular person, it's very easy for me to locate injustices within religion, and I've made the choice that that's not for me. But we also need to look at questions. We also need to look at how we might perpetuate similar injustices, right? This is only going to make our movement and our coalition stronger. So questions like, who among each of us is dedicated to practicing anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-homophobic policies? And if that undergirds the work that you do, injustice issues across the board, not just church-state separation issues, that's going to be a pathway for you to build coalitions with other people. So, an example. So, in an address at the National Prayer Breakfast in February, President Trump vowed to, in his words, get rid of and totally destroy the Johnson Amendment. And so I already polled you on who's familiar with the Johnson Amendment, so let's get into that. So the American Tax Code grants houses of worship and other nonprofits a special tax-free status. The Johnson Amendment is a provision in the tax code. It's been around for about 60 years, and it just protects the integrity of these two organizations by ensuring that they do not endorse or oppose political candidates. That's it. That's all it does. That's all it addresses. And this law still allows for churches, nonprofits, their leaders to be able to fully exercise their free speech. In fact, they speak on social and political issues all the time. Americans United, for example, were very critical of some of the things that Donald Trump said on the election trail that were clearly movements towards policies that would violate church-state separation. We weren't, however, allowed to oppose his candidacy through this law. Okay, so the Johnson Amendment and the religious right. I think for a big question here is, that I thought was quite interesting, was I don't get the sense that Donald Trump is super familiar with the ins and outs of our tax policy. So why is he talking about the Johnson Amendment, right? And it has to do with the religious right. So there's actually a story about what happened, and essentially he was meeting with religious leaders on the religious right, and they said, we're great, you're great, Donald Trump, we love you, whatever. And he said, great, so go out and endorse me. And they said, well, we can't, actually, it's not legal to. There's this thing called the Johnson Amendment, and it prevents us from doing it. And his response, I'll get rid of it. So all of the talking points, the Johnson Amendment stifles our religious freedom, our right to free speech, it's not real. That's why I put the big false up here.
There's some hands up. Just really quick clarification.
Yeah.
You said that because of the Johnson Amendment, nonprofits and churches, the state percent of the worship,
Yeah.
can't endorse or oppose. What do you mean? You can financially oppose or endorse, or because you said free speech is allowed, they can make statements. But what do you mean by?
So that it's just limited to. So pretend I'm preaching and you're all my congregation, right? For example, if I were up here and I'm under my religious title and I'm saying, I would like you to go out and vote for Donald Trump. Donald Trump is amazing. Our faith calls us to support Donald Trump. And so, and we're going to have a bus out front on voting day, and before you get on the bus, you need to tell us that you're going to vote for Donald Trump, and then we'll take you to the polling place, right? So it's not about issues. You can, religious leaders and heads of nonprofits can talk about issues, right? So that is their free speech to do. Also, if they do want to endorse a political candidate, they can do it on their own time, but they can't force their congregation, right? Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Right, exactly. My little graph didn't show up, sorry, but it's kind of on the side here. So who supports the Johnson Amendment? Majority of Americans is the short answer. It varies slightly based on how pollsters ask the question, but the majority of Americans support the Johnson Amendment. So, and it's really a broad group of people, right? I mean, 66% of Americans, this is a broad group of people. And so when we at Americans United decided to work and build a coalition around this, a multi-faith coalition, we're bringing in lots of different reasons that people are supporting this work. And the work needs to come on the front end because you need to be ready for rapid response. So does anyone have a guess who some of the major groups that are invested in protecting the Johnson Amendment might be? Yeah. The ACLU, right. Civil rights organizations, broadly, absolutely.
Yours, the American United?
Yep. People interested in maintaining church-state separation and the integrity of a secular government, absolutely.
Religious groups?
Religious groups, yep. A lot of religious groups. Any guesses as to why?
They don't want other religious groups getting favor over theirs.
It's part of it, absolutely. What would happen if you had a congregation and you told your folks to, and it was a super progressive organization, you're all Democrats, but you told your congregation during the primaries to vote for Bernie Sanders? What if you'd lose your tax status, but also what if you had Clinton supporters or Jill Stein supporters, right? It's very divisive for congregations to do this. This is a major concern of religious groups that are working with us. Any other guesses? There's another big major group that's working with us here. That's not, I'll give it to you. People worried about dark money. People worried about the flow of money into elections with no way to tell where it's coming from, right? So this is a very important issue. Okay. So before I make some space for some additional questions, so here's kind of the bottom line. When you do the work on the front end and you find the very challenging work on the front end and you find the threads that bring folks together to do this coalition work, You can take your messaging and you give it to multiple people who have authority in their own communities to go out and do this work. And whether that be you bringing it back to your secular community and getting people fired up to work on an issue, or religious leaders bringing it back to their own community, your reach is broader and it's more effective when you have the right messenger and a cohesive message. So for this particular issue, the Johnson Amendment, these are kind of the main talking points, core messaging that we have come up with this large federal coalition. Charities and houses of worship are tax-free because they work for the common good, not so they can support political candidates. Political parties and candidates seeking power should not be allowed to use churches and charities as political campaign tools. Houses of worship and their leaders have robust free speech rights and can already speak out on political and social issues. And Americans don't want churches in the business of endorsing or opposing political candidates, right? So I don't have a neat way to wrap this up because I'm hoping that people do have questions or comments, and so I will get to that. Yeah.
So, from what I understand from what you said about the Johnson Amendment keeping religious organizations and churches from opposing or promoting a candidate, how do you feel about the opposite? How a candidate, or at least in our local elections in Alabama, one of the first things that they say when they're like, "Hi, I'm so-and-so running for this, and I'm a Southern Baptist, part of this denomination and this church community."
Mm-hmm.
Why is it not like an issue in the mirror? You know, like why is it that information can be shared when they're being elected if those congregations can't talk about it from their end either?
So what you're asking is, why doesn't the U.S. tax code prevent political candidates from announcing their religious affiliation?
I think it's more so, I guess, an observation.
Okay.
It doesn't seem right that they would share their religious persuasion anyway.
Right. Well, it certainly is feels exclusive, to be sure. And I think that's. I think that's something that's. There's an issue of representation. There's an issue of exclusivity. I'm not sure, and I'm not a lawyer or a tax law expert. I'm not sure that would be something that would fall into tax law. But if you want to be connected with some of our folks at AU and ask that question, I'd be happy to get your information. It's a great question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This seems like a great opportunity. I'm just trying to think to educate. If you want to teach people about the Johnson Amendment and what Trump is trying to do, what would be but I could understand where some people, especially if they're really religious, may have trouble discerning between free speech and not letting them endorse. What would be a really good way to try to gently do that? What do you think?
Sorry, can you repeat? I didn't hear the end.
What would be a good way to kind of, because some people are going on about they can't say what they want. Really, they can talk about the issues, just not endorse the candidate that has those issues.
Mm-hmm.
What's a good way to kind of, because when you educate, separate things like that, what would be a good way to just teach about the Johnson Amendment in general?
I think that's a good question. I think to emphasize points that address kind of the false narrative that largely the religious right is perpetuating right now is that the Johnson Amendment is something that stifles religious leaders, and it doesn't let them talk about anything they believe. And it's really not the case. It's a very, very narrow policy, and it's one that's applied to nonprofits as well. And it's basically just to say nonprofits and churches don't pay taxes, so they should not be able to endorse or oppose religious candidates. And that sentiment, when you say it that way, in the polls that have been done, that is what is broadly supported by Americans. Yep, absolutely. Yeah.
Last question. Do you think Trump actually has the backing or the motivation from Congress to get the Johnson Amendment revoked?
That's a really good question. I will say that a few years ago, oh, feels like years, a few weeks ago, there was a provision kind of snuck into a House financial bill that basically what it said is any sort of violations of this would have to go first through the IRS commissioner, and that he would have to get it approved through Congress before he could investigate it. So you know how often that would happen, right? So this is something that's still there's going to be another markup. People are working very hard to get this removed, but there is an imminent danger, definitely. Yeah. Oh, I think that was my last question. Thank you so much.